Fellas, today we're going to be taking a look at the most underappreciated UFC fighters of all time. These are fighters that kind of have little hype but a lot of talent, or UFC fighters that were always in second place, or just fighters that achieved a lot but never really get talked about. And we're going to be taking a look at a few examples today. Before we get into it, if you agree with these takes, again, like the video. If you have any of your takes of your own that maybe I missed out, then please comment it. And yeah, we're just going to go straight in there with the first fighter that's been underappreciated, and we're going with Alexander Gustafsson. He's very underappreciated, and the reason is, I feel like he was in the wrong era of light heavyweight. I feel like if Alexander Gustafsson, and I'm talking about prime Alexander Gustafsson, if he was in like other eras of heavyweight, not heavyweight, light heavyweight. So for example, the pre-DC, pre-John Jones era, or even the current era, I think he would have a lot of success. It's just when he was fighting and when he was in his prime, John Jones was also fighting and so were DC. He was just always in second place or third place. He was never right there, but he was extremely talented. Obviously, the fight he had with Glover Teixeira, he put a really good fight on with Daniel Cormier. Some people even think that the first fight with Jones, some people think Gustafsson won the fight. So for me, Gustafsson is extremely underappreciated. I never really see anyone talking about him. Yeah, he's always just the guy who nearly beat Jones and nearly beat DC, but never did. So he's just been really unlucky in the sense that his prime was in the prime of John Jones. Well, maybe not the prime, but in the presence of John Jones as well. But he is one of the best light heavyweights ever. Gustafsson, whether you want to like it or not, he's one of the best light heavyweights ever. He has had a bit of a fall off, you know, he's been getting finished a lot, but in his prime, this guy was amazing. One of the best light heavyweights, and again, no one really talks about him. All the focus on light heavyweight is John Jones, DC. No one really remembers Gustafsson because he was never the best. He was always second or third place behind DC and Jones. But I can guarantee if prime Gustafsson was fighting nowadays, he'd be one of the best fighters in the light heavyweight division. Arguably champ, but Alexander Gustafsson, very underappreciated. No one really gives him the credit he deserves, and I think we should, because like I said, he's had some absolute wars. He's such a fun fighter as well. The fight with Glover Teixeira, the fight with DC, the fight with Jones, it feels like ever since the first Jones fight, he's kind of gone on a bit of a downfall. Obviously, Jones finished him in the second fight, and just obviously recently he's not been doing great either. He's been getting finished a lot. I mean, didn't he get finished in one round against Nikita Krylov? But still, Alexander Gustafsson for me is one of the most underappreciated UFC fighters. He was a different guy in his prime, man. He was one of the best in his prime, but it's just a shame he was always the second best and never the best. But anyway, next up we have one of the greatest of all time, Demetrius Johnson. I've got people who I know who leave Demetrius Johnson out of the GOAT list. Whenever the greatest of all time list gets brought up, it's always John Jones, GSP, Khabib, Silva, and no one ever gives Demetrius Johnson the credit he deserves. And this is, I mean, there was literally times when Demetrius Johnson fought for the belt on fight nights. I forgot exactly which fight it was, but there was times when he fought for a belt on fight nights. Imagine nowadays Brandon Moreno or Pantoja fighting for their belt on a fight night. That's only things that women fighters do. Imagine Brandon Moreno or Pantoja fighting on a fight night main event. That's how disrespected he was. They knew that he couldn't sell a pay-per-view. They knew that no one wanted to watch him on pay-per-view, so they just stuck him on fight nights, and it's pretty disrespectful, to be honest with you. But I think he's most regarded on the GOAT list. Disregarded. I mean, he's just very... everyone just skips past him. They want to put him on the GOAT list, but they don't really know why. Everyone's focused on, like I said, Jones, GSP, Silva, Khabib, and I've got him in my top 3 of all time. I think he's the 3rd greatest of all time. Personally, I'd put John Jones and GSP above him, but I'd still put him in my top 5 greatest of all time list. And there are people, like I said, that I know that wouldn't even put him in the top 5 list. They say, oh, he fought bums, he fought cans in his career, he was boring, he was overrated. He's still winning to this day as well. He's in ONE FC and he's still getting wins. So you've got to, if we're talking about pure MMA, he's definitely one of the greatest of all time. Very, very few losses. Dominated all the fight. Look, that fight with Ray Borg, that armbar submission, man, that was insane. The fights with John Dodson as well. This guy in his prime, I still think he's the greatest flyweight ever. So you've got to give it to Demetrius Johnson, and I can't believe they swapped him for Ben Askren. Of all people, they swapped Demetrius Johnson, one of the most talented, one of the greatest of all time, and he was swapped for funky Ben Askren. The only positive that the UFC got out of that is that we got Masvidal, who's a star because he knocked out Askren, but Swapping Askren for Demetrius Johnson wasn't a great mistake. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Demetrius Johnson just can't sell pay-per-views, but as a fighter, he's completely disregarded and no one really appreciates him for what he's done in the sport. Anyway, we're going to be moving on to the next fighter, which is Aljamain Sterling. Now, he has just been knocked out by Sean O'Malley, but still, people disrespect Sterling too much, man. I think he's one of the guys. I still think he's top 2 bantamweights of all time. Of course, I think Dominic Cruz is above him, but you've got to be honest, Sterling had a good run. He beat Henry Cejudo, who a lot of people were picking Cejudo to beat him. He beat Henry Cejudo, he beat Corey Sandhagen, put Sandhagen to sleep, and look what Sandhagen's doing nowadays. He beat PTN twice. Obviously, the first one was a fluke, so I'm not necessarily going to count that, but he beat him fair and square in the rematch, and he also beat TJ Dillashaw. Yes, TJ Dillashaw had arm problems, but that's not Sterling's fault. TJ Dillashaw came into the fight knowing that he had shoulder issues, so you can't blame Sterling for all these, the knee. You can't blame Sterling for the arm problem with TJ Dillashaw. He did everything he could and he beat everyone when he could. And he's just been completely disrespected after O'Malley's loss. Obviously, O'Malley's a way bigger star, so I understand, but it's kind of like people are acting like Sterling's one of the worst bantamweights when he beat a lot of contenders, and I think he could, he's still a very, very good contender. I don't know who they match him up against next. The fact that the UFC were considering to match up Adesanya against Sean Strickland in an immediate rematch, and they weren't even thinking about Aljamain Sterling rematching Sean O'Malley. But yeah, he's got a really underrated legacy. You look at the people he's beaten, and it's fairly underrated. I mean, imagine Sean O'Malley were to go out there, beat Yan, beat Dillashaw, I know he's beaten Yan, but beat Dillashaw, beat Sandhagen, and beat Cejudo. People would be saying he's the greatest bantamweight of all time. I still think he's one of the best grapplers at bantamweight. Obviously, we've got people like Merab, we've got Sandhagen, who's a new grappler, we've even got Uman Magomedov, but I still think Aljamain Sterling, he's the human backpack. You've got to give him credit. In his prime, he was different, man. Aljamain Sterling, he was a different guy. I actually want to see him back, man. He might not be able to sell a pay-per-view. He might have a little bit of a boring style, but people disrespect him. He's still one of the best bantamweights of all time. But anyway, next up, we have Dan Henderson. No one talks about Dan Henderson anymore. He was one of the most dangerous in his prime. In his prime, he was so dangerous. He was extremely tough as well. You getting hit by Dan Henderson must have been painful. I mean, we all saw the Bisping knockout. He has some serious wins. He's got a win over Fedor Emelianenko, who's one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Some people think, well, let's be honest, he's the greatest heavyweight of all time, just never joined the UFC. But he's got a win over Fedor. Obviously, he beat Bisping the first time, knocked him out cold. He beat Shogun. He beat a juiced-up Vitor Belfort, Wanderlei Silva. He was a very dangerous guy in his prime. He was brutal. He's a very scary guy. If you're getting matched up against Dan Henderson, no one wants to be matched up against Dan Henderson in his prime, put it that way. He's extremely tough. He's not going to go down easily. He hit like a truck. Finished people very regularly. You've got to give it to Dan Henderson. I don't really see much people talking about him anymore, and that's the problem. They always just skim past Dan Henderson. You look at him as a fighter, you look at him in his prime, he was an absolute killer. He's kind of like that. He kind of reminded me of the Robbie Lawler in the upper weight classes. That's how I just remember. He reminded me of the Robbie Lawler in the upper weight classes. Just extremely dangerous, willing to die in the octagon. But yeah, no one really talks about Dan Henderson. It's a shame because he was a great fighter, let's be honest. He was one of the best. But either way, Dan Henderson, very underappreciated. Next up, we have Tyron Woodley, T. Wood. Yes, he had a failed rapping career. Yes, he did get slept by Jake Paul. But can we stop disrespecting him as a fighter? People are saying, he's a joke of the UFC. He's not a joke, man. In his prime, he was pretty decent. Just because he lost to Jake Paul, let's not leave him behind. I mean, are we going to leave Anderson Silva behind for losing to Jake Paul as well? He's one of the greatest welterweights ever. Whether you want to put him in number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, he's definitely in top 5 greatest welterweights of all time. But he's one of the greatest welterweights ever for me. Obviously, he's got wins over Robbie Lawler, Stephen Thompson, Kelvin Gastelum, Damian Maia, even Darren Till. And in that Darren Till fight, Darren Till couldn't hit him once. Look at the stats for that fight. Darren Till had 0 significant strikes. In his prime, Tyron Woodley was a dangerous guy, man. He was a dangerous guy. He had powerful hands. He was a great wrestler as well. Ragdoll Darren Till, like I said. He beat Lawler, like I said. Beat Wonderboy. There was not much people that could beat Tyron Woodley in his prime, and he was a dangerous fighter in his prime. One of the greatest welterweights ever. I still think, obviously, he's not better than Kamaru Usman. Usman did finish him. He's not better than, obviously, GSP. Matt Hughes, obviously, you can argue says above him, but he's one of the best welterweights of all time, and no one remembers him. It's kind of sad that his legacy's just kind of being remembered as the guy who got slept by Jake Paul. He did go on a bit of a losing streak towards the end of his career as well, but in his prime and in his early career, he was good, man. He was a good fighter, and no one talks about him. Like I've said this like 50 times already, but they've just been forgotten about. The MMA community has kind of just forgotten about this guy, and in his prime, he was a dangerous welterweight, man. He was a dangerous welterweight. I know a lot of people thought he was going to beat Kamaru Usman as well. People thought he was going to be the guy to stop Kamaru Usman in the UFC, and it wasn't the case. Obviously, he got battered, but either way, he was a dangerous guy, man. He was a dangerous guy in his prime. But either way, we're moving on to the final guy on the list, Rafael dos Anjos. This guy, look at his record. He has got one of the most brutal resumes in UFC. He's fought Vicente Luque, Leon Edwards, Khabib, Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, Robbie Lawler, Tony Ferguson, Eddie Alvarez, Nate Diaz, Anthony Pettis, Donald Cerrone, and Rafael Fiziev. And those are only just a handful of the people that he's fought. This guy has fought some absolute killers in the UFC. He's been in the UFC since 2008. I actually believe out of everyone in the UFC, he's been in the UFC the second longest. I think the only person above him is Andrei Arlovski, but this guy needs more recognition. He does need more recognition. He's kind of just another lightweight. Most people just view him as another lightweight. Can we start giving him the appreciation he deserves? He's a forgotten former champion. No one remembers him. I can't speak. No one remembers him as being the former lightweight champion, but look at the resume he's fought. I think he's the real BMF. He's willing to fight anyone, doesn't duck fights. He'll literally just fight anyone, anywhere, any place, anytime. I mean, he just had a fight now with Vicente Luque, and he's still doing well to this day. That fight with I can't speak today. Mocciano. That fight with Mocciano, bro, he absolutely mauled him. I think it was UFC 272. He absolutely mauled him. He's still going to this day. I know he just come off a loss to Vicente Luque, but still, it was a close fight as well. It wasn't like Vicente Luque just ran through him. It was a fairly close fight, but Rafael dos Anjos, UFC since 2008, and he's still winning and doing all right to this day. You got to give it to Rafael dos Anjos, man. He's one of the best. Well, actually, he's probably not one of the best lightweights, but he's tough. He's BMF, 100% the BMF, and no one gives him credit for it. People are saying Masvidal. How is Masvidal a BMF and Rafael dos Anjos isn't? That doesn't make sense. But either way, that is my list for UFC fighters that have been completely underappreciated. Like I said at the start, if you agree with these takes, let me know. If I missed anyone out, please comment it. And yeah, thank you for watching.